Okay. I'm very happy to introduce Saskia Bricmont. Saskia Bricmont, thank you for being here despite a very busy calendar schedule. You are a member of the EU Parliament, deputy, a member of the group of the Greens, and also member of the Libe committee. And we know that you and the Greens and other ones are interested in asylum law and immigration issues. For instance, and notably recently, with other members of the group of the Greens, you are the author of some questions. Only in 2022, you asked some questions about the practice of illegal pushbacks of asylum seekers on commercial ships from Italy to Greece in the very beginning of the year, in January. Also about the use of clandestine detention centers, cages, and torture along the EU external borders, again in January. And also about all the, more largely, the violation of fundamental rights at EU borders. It is an issue for you and for other people working with you, notably in the Libe committee, but not only. And we think that the involvement and the vigilance of deputies as you is fundamental in these matters, where the argument of sovereignty of states is often used to justify human rights violation and practices that are worrying under the rule of law. And the challenges are many. Building solidarity is one of them and is a current challenge currently discussed in the EU Parliament. It was possible to welcome Ukrainian refugees. It must be possible beyond this emergent situation. And taking charge of vulnerabilities despite the complexity but also the richness of the concept and the potential of this concept is another one. So, Mrs. Bricmont, thank you for being here, and you have the floor for about 10, 12 minutes, and after that we will have a discussion with you and Mrs. Bricmont. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sylvie, for this nice introduction. And yes, busy schedule, especially because we are in the middle of the negotiations on the Asylum and Migration Pact. Amongst others, we have 200 legislative files to finalize by, I was going to say in this year, but earlier, because you know that in politics the campaign will start soon if it hasn't started yet. You might have seen it. And so, yes, busy agenda, but I'm really delighted to be here and to have the opportunity to discuss this very important topic. You said it, important to my heart, important to the Greens' heart. And unfortunately, less and less politicians are actually interested in the topic and also trying to build another asylum and migration policy, both at EU and at national level. But I will come back to that during my intervention. And so, as you mentioned, I'm a member of several committees, but also the Libe committee dealing with asylum and migration files. And I'm myself in charge of several files, mainly focused on security issues. For instance, I hate to use that word because we should apprehend security in another way. But when it comes to migration, you know that it is also relevant. And I'm in charge of the Eurodac file. I don't know if many of you are familiar with that one. With my colleagues, we of course share the work amongst the different files of the Asylum Pact. And in my work as an MEP, I'm also really much focused on fundamental rights, security and fundamental rights, and the impact of policy making or decisions on the fundamental rights in general, but also on the most vulnerable, including migrants, including children and vulnerable people. And people in the migration are, by essence, very vulnerable situation. And I believe it is also of utmost importance as legislator, as politician, to address those vulnerabilities. So while today we are waiting for the outcome of the member states' discussion on solidarity mechanisms in the asylum procedure regulation and the asylum migration management regulation files, I would like to focus my intervention on how EU policies on migration and asylum covers, or rather does not cover, migrants' vulnerabilities, as it might echo concerns that are also mentioned in your study. For better or worse, for about a decade now, migration and asylum have been on the top of the EU agenda. Reforms after reforms, proposals after proposals, the EU is setting the framework for migration and asylum legislation. We are, as you may be aware, currently working on the European Pact on Migration and Asylum, which is the successor of the failed, because member states did not manage to reach an agreement, of the failed common European asylum system. What we can see throughout the architecture being put in place is the securitization of migration and asylum policies. We're not talking about how to ensure the well-being of migrant people. We're not talking about how to make migration safe and secure. We're not talking about how to make migration an opportunity for both exiled people and host countries. We're not talking about saving lives at sea or at borders. On the contrary, our discussions are mainly focused about how to prevent migration to take place, about how to circumvent international human rights obligations, what several, if not all, member states already do, about how to organize Fortress Europe and build fences, preferably with EU money, and how to quantify the price of non-applying solidarity. Don't be mistaken, I use we in a rather rhetorical manner. I refer to the European Commission, led by Commissioner Johansson and Vice President Skinas on that field, to the Member States and the Council, very eager to discuss fingerprinting in Eurodac and screening, but not how to ensure solidarity and decent reception in Europe. At the European Parliament level, I'm afraid, or desperate, depending on the days, to say that most political groups officially fighting the far right are, in the same time, using similar rhetoric and political solutions when it comes to migration as the far right parties. Far right has won an ideological battle in making migration and asylum a problem. They won again when one started criminalizing migrants and citizens and NGOs. In this context, how can we expect vulnerabilities to be addressed? As you can understand, taking into consideration migrants' vulnerabilities and their individualities is not at the heart of this pact. On the contrary, this pact favors a quite managerial and securitarian vision of migration. Migrants and asylum seekers are not human beings with vulnerabilities, but numbers to be managed. Asylum and migration policy is part of the major failures of this Commission. Far from addressing the needs of the most vulnerable, it failed to give a human dimension and decided to co-finance detention centers and surveillance technologies or cover Frontex mismanagement instead of saving people's lives at sea and at borders. The increasing collection of migrants' data shows this trend. The EU has spent huge resources on big data and creating a colossal interoperable migration IT system. This policy is based on an assumed link between migration and terrorism. We need to interrogate the basis of such assumptions and disrupt the narrative that all people perceived as foreigners are potential threats to public safety. As long as we continue with those assumptions, we will not be able to address the vulnerabilities of migrant people. we immediately have the image of what the Greek authorities qualify of identification and registration centers when we talk about this. And those centers, you might also know it, are more like detention camps, where people are stuck for many months, with children also, and few facilities nor access to education, including unaccompanied minors. But if this image is the most powerful, I will also give you two examples, which are less known, but very meaningful on how vulnerabilities, in my view, are vehemently disregarded. When it comes to children, under the APR Asylum Procedure Regulation, currently negotiated, children from the age of 12 are considered as adults and threatened and treated as such. The screening regulation foresees that children as from 12 will undergo security checks and screening procedure. This will clearly lead to minors' detention. Eurodac regulation, for whom I'm a shadow for the Green AFE group, organizes the collection of fingerprints and biometrics data from the age of 6. Why 6? Well, it is rather cynical, because beforehand, fingerprints are not mature enough. While some are shamelessly saying that this aims at protecting children, especially unaccompanied minors, I only see a security mechanism being put in place against children, against migrant children, against foreign children. It is very frustrating to see developed a welcomed EU strategy on children's rights, on the one hand, and seeing children's rights being shamelessly disregarded in the migration context at the other hand. My second example concerns the people disembarked from search and rescue operations in the Mediterranean. The European Commission proposed the creation of a new category under this Eurodac database for disembarked people from search and rescue operations. While, as Greens, we welcomed this creation of category, we believe taking into account the very vulnerabilities of people who may have come close to death during their journey may be treated with specific care. However, the proposal does not foresee any specific safeguards when they are being registered in Eurodac, fingerprinted, photographed, including children as from 6 years old. The Pact of the European Commission, nor any related measures, does not foresee measures to support search and rescue operations, nor create European operations in that regard. The Pact and current legislations being negotiated are full of examples on how vulnerabilities are disregarded or even exacerbated. In addition to legislation, we can also elaborate on the reception conditions for people on the move in member states and how they fail to address migrants' vulnerabilities. Without surprise, I would like to say a few words about the situation in my own country, Belgium. You may have heard about the infamous crise de l'accueil taking place in this country, and more specifically in Brussels, where until recently nearly 3,000 asylum seekers were sleeping in the street due to the lack of proper reception infrastructure. While women and children are prioritized when accessing the system, vulnerable adults are often left behind. Even worse, I strongly believe that those terrific reception conditions actually lead to the development and the worsening of such vulnerabilities. According to your report on Belgium, we understand that vulnerabilities are not properly addressed by the governmental authorities. There is a lack of communication, of coordination between these authorities. Vulnerabilities are addressed in a rather technical way and not a comprehensive and substantive manner. And there is not enough flexibility in the administrative procedures, which makes them not adapted to individual vulnerabilities. And this has to change. We need member states to take their responsibility, and maybe you mentioned some venues for that, by adopting a welcoming and open migration policy with individual and also appropriate support. I have to point the role of civil society and associations, which you also stress in your report. It is a key role when the government and the EU doesn't take its part. Associations and NGOs play an essential role in supporting vulnerable migrants and more generally at all stages of the migrants' journey, from their arrival through their asylum application procedures to their integration. I know there are many civil society actors in the room and would like to salute their work, your work. This is why we, as Greens, defend also the rights of NGOs and of citizens that are rescuing people, because these rights are also under attack. The criminalization of solidarity has to stop. However, while we should applaud the work of civil society and support from citizens, we should constantly remind member states of their obligations, and the European Commission, as guardian of the EU treaties, it is also responsible for ensuring application of the EU law through infringement procedures if need be. To conclude, and apologies, I've been quite unoptimistic, I strongly believe that in order to be able to address migrants' vulnerabilities and more generally prevent violations of migrants' fundamental rights, the only way ahead is a drastic change of the migration and asylum policy. We collectively, the few remaining at political level, NGOs, citizens, all together, need to reverse the current agenda and narrative. If we don't, we can only expect the current situation and issues to worsen over the coming months and years, to the very detriment of migrants, especially the most vulnerable, but also to the detriment of the EU values as a whole. When a society fails to protect its most vulnerable members, it cannot be called democratic. It's now becoming a matter of civilization. Solidarity, humanism, safe and legal pathways, inclusion are the keywords for a brighter future for people in migration, including the most vulnerable. I thank you for your attention. I thank you again for the future exchanges, and I'm happy to answer any question. Thanks.
So it's wonderful because we have 15 minutes for your questions. So please feel free to ask questions, give your name, and maybe explain who you are for Saskia. François.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I'm François Bienfait, Director for ADDE, Association pour l'étranger. Formerly, I worked in the Agency for Asylum, the Asylum Agency. My question is just to know after what you say, and knowing that the Pact on Immigration and Asylum is a package, that means that the states have decided that everything will be agreed together or nothing. Would you consider that the pact, which is supposed to land during the Belgian presidency, that would be a good or a bad news? In other words, do you think that NGOs and civil society, which are present in number here, should really fight against the position of Belgium since the pact will land during its presidency? Thank you.
Very, very good and interesting question. Thank you for that. This is a question we ask ourselves as well, as Greens, because our first intention was to contribute to the negotiations and to push as hard as we could to include better safeguards, better fundamental rights disposals to actually improve the situation compared to the status quo and what is currently applied by our member states at borders and procedures, etc. We tried until the end, and it didn't prevent us from voting majority majorly, en majorité, yeah, in a major way against against the different files, because our assessment of what we want compared to what is in the text, including detention, no exclusion of children detention, no willingness to rule at EU level on that one, prolongation, and when you cumulate the different texts of the pact, you can end up legally to 10 months of detention during the procedures at borders, etc. And so our assessment was quite negative at the outcome of the European Parliament position, knowing that we will lose many of the things we want. For instance, the creation of a body at borders to control the respect of fundamental rights, external and internal borders, a monitoring mechanism at borders. That's in the European Parliament version, but we know that the Council doesn't want it. And so during the negotiations with the member states, we'll probably lose the couple of wins that we managed to get during the negotiations in the Parliament. And so our assessment was, okay, should we vote in favor of the European Parliament position to show a common approach which is stronger and more democratic than the one that the Council will defend, and be on board of that, less worse proposal at the end? Or should we, on the contrary, from the beginning say this is not the kind of policy we want to support? And that's the choice we made, because overall, when we assess the different files, and I'd be happy to provide with more specific input on the files and our position if you'd like, it doesn't really improve the situation for people in migration on the ground, and it will not prevent member states from doing what they are currently doing. And this is the shame, because it will actually legalize the current practices. And this is what is highly problematic to us. And as a Belgian, I have a huge problem, political problem, is that our Secretary of State, Nicole Demour, which is from the EPP group, so one of the most conservative group rejecting search and rescue operation at EU level, etc., is Secretary of State in charge, and she will claim victory with the adoption of the Migration Asylum Pact that has been blocked for more than 10 years now, and present it as the solution to the crise de l'accueil happening now in Belgium, which is, again, not true, because, for instance, what is foreseen in the crisis management is that in case of the recognition of a crisis in a member state, recognized by the Commission with several safeguards, but nevertheless, I can imagine that the current crisis in Belgium would be recognized as a crisis in regard of the crisis management document. The derogation to the acquis and derogation to the length of the procedures would be possible. Although we know that in Belgium, one of the issues related to the crise de l'accueil is already the length of the procedures. And Belgium would be actually allowed under the crisis management regulation to do what is currently happening. That's one example amongst others why we think this pact will not bring actual solutions. Currently is being discussed. I will try to be shorter in my answers, but it's important what you are asking, because you also ask what should we do as a civil society. And this is a huge question, because either you push the governments, including Belgium, to accept, to include, but I fear it's too late already, because their position is quite fixed on several parts of the Asylum Pact. Either you push them to keep and to align on the EP position, which is better than the Commission's initial proposal, That might be step one. And if you see that the Council is not going into that direction and is watering down the proposal of the European Parliament too much, including on fundamental rights, safeguards, etc., then scream loud to say that the behavior of Belgium and the member states is not okay, is not in line with commitments of Belgium, for instance, to protect fundamental rights at borders. It's in the governmental agreement. And so that could be step two, because I fear that the communication of a majority of member states, if not all of them, and the majority of political groups will be positive about the pact. A couple of weeks before the elections, June 2024, showing European citizens that we got a solution to asylum problems, right? That will be the mainstream narrative. And I think, unfortunately, that we have to go against this because it's not true.
Hi, my name is Alan Påske. I'm from the Institute of Social Research in Norway. You mentioned that you were part of the LIBE committee, and I know the LIBE committee has been very instrumental in bringing about the resignation of Fabrice Leggeri, the executive director of Frontex. I was just wondering if you could say something about that, like how important is the removal of Fabrice Leggeri from Frontex, and how do you see the kind of the potential for establishing the required checks and balances on Frontex in the future? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. We could do a workshop on Frontex, of 2 days workshop on Frontex. It was a very political strong moment because it marked a real switch. I don't know if everyone is familiar with the inside story of Frontex and what happened those last years, but mismanagement, internal mismanagement, harassment, different issues related to human resources management, but also allegations and inquiries against the Frontex agency, which is in charge of border management and fundamental rights at borders, but they often forget the second part of their mission. What was I saying? Mismanagement, allegations, inquiries against the agency for maybe not contributing, but at least hiding pushbacks, illegal pushbacks at borders, where agents are supposed to report if they see such situations on the ground, and we know it's happening. We have, can I say, thousands of reports of NGOs showing what is happening at our borders, and which was constantly openly denied by Frontex, but also by the Commission. And the European Parliament, you might know that we have limited powers, unfortunately. This is part of the frustration of being an MEP, is we have no initiative power, we have no real, I would say, scrutiny power. The scrutiny we have on EU agencies is mostly budgetary. We are in charge of the budgetary discharge of the agencies. And for the first time ever, we managed, and Greens, but also Renew, I have to acknowledge that from Renew side, one of the main leader MEPs is Sophie in 't Veld from the Netherlands. And we were really strong in pushing for putting in place a Frontex scrutiny group because of all the problems, accumulated problems at the agency level, which did a very good inquiry work, this Frontex informal body. No formal existence, so I fear in the next mandate that this scrutiny group might disappear if we do not manage to make it permanent. But the members of the scrutiny group issued a report in line also with the Olaf inquiry and recommendations, etc., and it led to the refusal of the budgetary discharge, demands for the executive director to leave the agency. But the thing is that we met in January, I think, with the new director, the new executive director. I don't have his name in mind right now, but I can share the info with you. We met with him in January, and he absolutely didn't talk about any suspicious pushbacks. And again, who revealed new pushbacks, including in Italy, and the fact that Frontex is complicit with those pushbacks, the press. And so he lied. He lied to us because there are leaks showing that the internal services were well aware of what was happening. So the new executive director lied. So we asked the question this week on the matter. We are asking for a new hearing, follow-up. But in the meanwhile, the last discharge was given to Frontex. My group opposed it because we said as long as it's not clean, as long as there is no full transparency towards the European Parliament, we cannot allow the discharge. It's the only power we have. Let's use it. It's the only leverage we have. And the other groups are like, no, look, there's a new director, we should trust him, we should have confidence, everything is going better, inquiries are closed, blah, blah, blah. Recommendations are being implemented. I still have no proof that those recommendations are being implemented. But I have a proof now that the new director doesn't seem really much better than the previous one if he lies in front of MEPs. And this is problematic, ongoing, and even if Commissioner Johansson on that one was quite critical towards Legeri and was also part of the process that made this happen, is withdrawal, I still think that she is closing her eyes now, again, on the real situation on the ground and related issues, pushbacks, illegal pushbacks, of course. Yeah.
So thank you so much. One more? Yes? Oh, one more.
Oh.
Thank you, Luc. Thank you, Luc. One more question?
Yeah.
No?
Yes, there.
Oh, yes, one there.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Müge Dalkran. I'm a scholar from Turkey, but also working on Greece in the asylum regime, so both in Greece and Turkey. And I wanted to ask about the third country agreements. As you know, with the EU-Turkey agreement and with the current situation, it complicates in multiple levels, including the political ones. And what happened also at the border zone between Greece and Turkey in 2020 showed us one more how dangerous it can be to give such power to authoritarian regimes. And with the new pact, there are more third country agreements provisions, as I know. So what is the situation there? If you can answer, I would be pleased. Thank you.
This is extremely worrying because the EU, as it fails to manage the migration policy internally, is externalizing its own failures, actually, and not only policies, to third countries, and not the least, as you mentioned, authoritarian regimes, with all the risks related to the chantage, thank you. It can induce, and we've seen it. Morocco has used it, Turkey. We can mention many countries, and the cooperation agreements that are under discussion between the UK and Rwanda, for instance, for the moment, and the fact that groups, including the first leader in that fight, the EPP, wants France to conclude an agreement with the UK, and so on and so on. And so this is one of the huge problems of the current practices, and which will be legalized and anchored in the Asylum and Migration Pact. And we want to end that. We want to put an end to those kind of agreements with third countries, because this is not the way we should deal with it, especially when we know what's the fate of migrant people in those countries, subject to torture and many other awful practices. But I fear, in the current context, that this is only the tip of the iceberg, because I'm also in the International Trade Committee. More and more trade cooperation tools are being used and linked to migration policy. Cooperation on migration in the first place, which is becoming readmission obligations, conditionalities. You get the EU funds, you get the EU money if you get your people back, basically. And so it's getting worse and worse. If they don't find a venue on, in one way or in Libe files, then they will find other venues in other files. And this is part of the worrying trend and security trend, especially when we see the use that member states and especially border countries like Greece use those agreements. And it's rather cynical, because we're talking again about people. We're talking about people, and it seems that our governments are not seeing the people behind their policies. I would be happy if you reach out to me, if you have any wish to further engage with us, the Greens, because I feel there's a lot of knowledge, expertise in this room. And this is what is nice about such exchanges. And of course, we work really much with EU representatives and stakeholders. But it's also sometimes important to have insight on Greece, and other national related matters. So do not hesitate to reach out to us. Maybe not all of you, because otherwise I will be woo-woo. But no, I'm joking. I would be delighted, and I'm not able to attend your conference, and I really regret it, because the program seems really rich, and I think it's always important. But my assistants do so. But it's always important to also work with civil society and get from your knowledge, your expertise. And I think this is a huge part of the problem, is that most of the other groups don't do so. They just have their own ideology about what we should do, instead of having a look on what is actually the reality of people in migration. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Okay. Thanks again, and we will have contact, I'm sure. I'm sure. It is time for coffee break now.
Yes, until 3.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's just out the back door.
Okay.